Welcome to the Citizens Band Radio Hour. Thoughtful conversations that explore issues of media and journalism, democracy and citizenship. The Citizens Band Radio Hour is sponsored by the Center for Media and Citizenship at the University of Virginia. You can visit the center online at mediaandcitizenship.org. Here's your host, Coy Barefoot.
Author, historian, and scholar Brendan Wolfe is the managing editor of the Encyclopedia Virginia, an online project of the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities. Brendan's most recent book is Mr. Jefferson's Telescope, a history of the University of Virginia in 100 objects. The Special Collections Library at the University of Virginia recently launched a new exhibit celebrating the book and the stories it tells. I recently enjoyed the good fortune to meet Brendan on grounds at the University of Virginia for a personally guided tour of the new exhibit and to discuss the book and the history of UVA.
The idea is to tell the history of the university 200 years from when it was chartered by the Commonwealth until now, to tell that history through objects. So it began with a cover story in the University of Virginia magazine in which they picked 50 objects and wrote little blurbs about them, and then the University of Virginia Press asked me to expand that into 100 objects and to write longer about each object. UVA magazine didn't really actually attempt to tell the history of UVA in those 100 objects. They were just sort of like little glimpses of the history. I took on the challenge, not really imposed on me except by myself, to take these objects which weren't picked with this in mind, but to take these objects and try to tell a coherent narrative, the beginning and a middle and an end for now.
Brendan, what are one or two takeaways that you got from that research, from that experience of 100 doorways of material culture into the past?
Well, I guess I was a little surprised at how I was able to draw out a pretty coherent history of UVA, one that is both positive and negative. I was surprised that certain strands of the history kind of wove through the entire thing. For me, those were white supremacy from the very beginning, the exclusion of women from the very beginning, and the idea that the mission was to train elite men. And those three things, which to our ears today sound kind of negative, but in 1819 were considered very mainstream, normal ideas on which to build an institution like the University of Virginia. Those things are baked into the cake and are a part of everything we see. And that's what struck me is, like, you know, the oddest items like this UVA cheerleader Barbie doll. You could see those threads working through even that item without even, you know, you have to be careful about how you approach it as a historian, you know, to sort of imposing kind of a narrative on stuff. But these kinds of things were popping up everywhere and keep reminding us this is a pretty complicated place with a complicated history.
The dichotomy and the tension that you're talking about is baked into America, not just UVA.
Right.
The extent to which UVA speaks to what America was all about, and the extent to which UVA was very much a realization of Jefferson and Madison's 1776 dreams of the enlightened citizen. Citizenship was a club, and only some people. How does the university reconcile that tension today, do you think? How do they come to grips with that?
Well, I think that's a process. I think the university has struggled to come to grips with it. So those three things, yes, are a part of the American experience. But even, even as UVA was enslaving African Americans on its grounds, other universities were accepting African Americans. By the 1890s, when the university was very reluctantly thinking about accepting some women on a very provisional basis, and still finding reasons to not accept women, sometimes reasons that had to do with white supremacy, surprisingly. Other universities had been accepting women for years. And so I would say UVA kind of has its own history, which is often at odds with the American mainstream and often represents the American mainstream, and how the university reflects back on that today. I mean, it's a process, man. I think we struggle with it. We struggle to both acknowledge and own that history and make this place our own and something that we celebrate.
It's that perennial struggle to constantly move closer to your ideals and to realize your ideals, and the challenge not to just give your ideals lip service, but to bring them into some kind of fruition.
I think that's exactly right. Yeah.
So where do you go first in here? Do you got a favorite?
I don't, and I think it's sort of the way that I wrote the book was that I just kind of gathered together 100 things without really thinking too hard about what each thing was, and then the challenge was finding connections between the objects and the object to the larger narrative that emerged of UVA history.
Yeah. So pick one object that illustrates the point you're making right now about connecting dots to the larger story.
In this exhibit, we've got, in this case here, we've got a lot of different things going on. We've got this book that has this drawing of a kind of archetypal university student. It was written by it was drawn by an artist who traveled around the United States, and he did drawings and he wrote travelogues. And so here's his drawing of an archetypal UVA student who's a kind of dandy young white male who at that time was the sort of reputation for students at UVA was to be disrespectful of their elders, to be pretty rowdy and often even violent. And that's from like the 1850s. And then you go to this university Barbie from 1997, and you've got this white, blonde-haired girl in a cheerleader's uniform. So right there you have just a huge change with just the idea of women being at the university. But another thing that's sort of complicated about it is that UVA, by being presented in the context of sports, and you're selling the colors and you're selling the idea of big time athletics, that's something that's been hugely controversial at the university for 100 years. Since the advent of football at the university, faculty and alumni have been terrified of the idea that athletics and competition were going to take over the university.
It's always been a bit of a love-hate relationship.
Yes, and they've been worried that the idea of the university as an elite place is going to be lost, and it's going to become like the big state U. Like my alma mater, the University of Iowa. The UVA sort of has always set itself up against that kind of place. And the idea that the toy company saw UVA in the same way that it saw the University of Michigan or Florida State or something is indicative of how far we've come even in 50 years.
And it also speaks to maybe the worry of those students in the 30s and early 40s that UVA would become the big state U. It speaks to the degree to which they lost that battle, that it indeed has become something of a big state university that they abhorred that idea.
Right. Colgate Darden, the university president in the 50s and 60s, was a really important figure in trying to expand the scope and reach of the university and to diversify its student body. And at one point, a faculty member said to him, "It almost seems like you're trying to make this the kind of place where anybody from Virginia could just go to school here." He says, "Yes, that's the point." But the idea that a faculty member would be like that would be almost difficult for them to imagine suggests, where it came from, where it was heading. And I think that same push and pull about who should be going to the school, you still see it. You still see it in the battle between the Board of Regents and the president. You see it in the battle between the university and the state about funding and who should be admitted and how much of a state school this should be. It's still really central, often in slightly different ways, but it's still central to life here at the university.
You see it in the anger and the dismay of parents in Fairfax County who can't get their kid who's got a 4.0, can't get them into UVA because they're competing with students from around the globe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then in the same case, you've got this is an Abercrombie and Fitch catalog, also from 1997, and it featured, among other things, students from the university modeling these clothes. And here they've got it open to an African American woman from UVA, and that's a big deal. Women have only been at the university since 1970. African American women are really like the last to show up at this school in any numbers. You had an African American man enroll in the 50s, but women as students in the college and the same level as everyone else, not until 1970, and that is so late in the scheme of things. And so between your UVA student in 1850 and your students in 1970 and your 1997 and your Barbie doll, it's a pretty huge leap. Special Collections has a burnt cross in its collection, and I was told about this cross. It's two pieces of wood tied together in the shape of a cross and then covered in burlap, and presumably, then doused in fluid and burnt on the lawn of a woman named Sarah Patton Boyle, who was a white middle-aged woman who was the wife of a university drama instructor. And in 1955, I think, she wrote an essay for the Saturday Night Evening Post about how Southerners will like integration. And it was a very sort of naive essay in which she talked about how Southerners, if they just tried it, would like integration way more than they think they would, and Northerners ought to recognize that Southerners aren't nearly so bad when it comes to race relations as everyone thinks they are. And she used as one of her primary examples the case of Gregory Swanson, who was the first African American admitted to the university. He was a lawyer who was admitted to the School of Law and treated so awfully that he quit. But in Sarah Patton Boyle's essay, he was treated famously, and it was an example of how well everything was going. And so she assumed that this, would get a pretty positive response, and in fact, she received lots of hate mail, lots of really blistering public responses. But to her credit, I think she grew up from that experience, became a bit more realistic, but became no less committed to integration. And she opposed, or what's a better way of putting this, she supported Brown v. Board of Education and opposed Virginia's policy of massive resistance, which was the idea of shutting down public schools rather than integrating them. And it was in the context of that fight that a year or two later, she had this cross burnt on her lawn. And the experience so horrified her that she wrote later she contemplated suicide. But again, to her credit, she decided to own that experience, and she actually preserved the cross, and she displayed it on her own wall. She put it on the cover of a memoir that she later wrote, and then eventually she gave it to the University of Virginia. And so I included it in the book. I think that there were a lot of really legitimate concerns about also including it in the exhibit. There was some fear that the proximity of the object itself and the really deep kind of violence that it represents against African Americans might be a little too provocative, might make some people feel unsafe. There was concern about what precisely it represented as a cross that was burned on a white woman's lawn instead of a black person's lawn. And I think that the folks at Special Collections really thought through those issues. I mean, one of the reasons we have this cross is because it's the cross we have. She gave it to us. African Americans at the university have not, where crosses were burned on their lawns, they didn't preserve them and give them to the university. And maybe to some extent that's an example, to borrow a phrase, of Sarah Patton Boyle's privilege, that she was able to sort of deal with it in that way, and maybe other people weren't. But anyway, it was in recognition of all these complications and concerns that the folks from Special Collections decided to make a space for it and include all the interpretive material, but not the cross itself. That sort of underlying all of it is this idea of, racist violence happening here in Charlottesville, yeah. and a torchlit march on grounds by white nationalists and neo-Nazis has made a lot of people in this city feel unsafe. And I think that while the university has a stake in wanting to tell an unvarnished history, and that people have a stake in confronting their own history, you kind of have to balance that with the reality of how difficult life in this town has been for the last month. And I don't think the university wants to upset anyone unnecessarily. This is actually a lock of his hair that was given to the university by his private secretary. And I remember sitting down with the book thinking, okay, what do I say about a lock of Jefferson's hair? And, saving a hair as a memento was a very typical sort of 18th century thing to do. So it seems kind of odd and morbid to us today, but it wasn't at all then. But I also think the fact that here we are 200 years later, and we've got this lock of Jefferson's hair in a case, in an exhibit at the university, it sort of seems indicative of just this sense of the university's own memory of its founder, and in some ways almost the cultish memory of him. I don't mean that totally in a pejorative sense, but the University of Virginia is very, very much participates in a cult of Jefferson. His body, as it's represented in statues around grounds and in this lock of hair, and then his ideas, are so much a part of this university, almost to a fault. We're hearing. You always hear, well, what would Jefferson do in this situation? Or what's the perfect Jefferson quote for this situation? And now we're actually getting some pushback on that, with some people complaining that the president maybe quotes Jefferson too much or in the wrong situation. And people are becoming a little more aware of or at least more willing to publicly acknowledge the complications of that cult of Jefferson. But if you're going to build a university around a person in this way, you could do worse with Jefferson. I think he's such a complicated, difficult, famously intelligent person, sui generis, that people have built whole careers trying to crack that code. And so, that's exactly the sort of thing you want a university trying to figure out. You want a university associated with something intelligent and complicated and befuddling. I don't know. It gives the university a certain amount of depth, I think. I remember when I started coming up with the list of objects, I didn't have too many that I knew I wanted in there, but one of them was this novel, Voyage to the Moon, which was published in 1827, so just 2 years after classes started at the university. And the author is listed as Joseph Adderley. It was a pseudonym for George Tucker, who was one of the original faculty members. And I've always been fascinated with Tucker because I feel like he's not very well known. He had a cousin, St. George Tucker, who was a very well-known jurist. The Tucker family was from Bermuda, and Tucker had served a term or two in the House of Representatives and had impressed Jefferson with a book of essays that he had written on politics and natural history. And so Jefferson invited him to the faculty. And while here, and he'd also written a novel that was considered by some to be the first sort of Southern plantation novel. And it actually flirts with being almost anti-slavery. In this novel, A Voyage to the Moon, it's about someone who actually travels to the moon and confronts like a different culture there. And so it's got this sci-fi element, which was very new and sort of cutting edge for that time, but he uses it basically to satire all kinds of different things going on in American culture and politics.
I've seen it described as the first science fiction novel in the United States. I don't know if that's accurate, but it's certainly among the first, if not the first.
Right. And it's sort of interesting because one of UVA's students at the time was Edgar Allan Poe, who then himself went on to write a novel that's also a science fiction novel, although whether he was directly influenced by Tucker, we don't know. Well, I feel like at this moment for historians in the United States, the idea of telling lots of different stories is really important. So thinking about, say, the Civil War, not just in terms of battles and leaders, but in terms of women and families and African Americans and the home front and all these different things. And so we bring that to thinking about a place like the University of Virginia, not just the students, but the enslaved men and women who helped build the university, who helped service and maintain the university for years. We think about what it means that women were excluded and then included, and how that's changed, and how we sort of think differently about the story now than we did, say, in 1980, when the last sort of semi-academic history was written. And there's been really so few histories that aren't kind of coffee table books, right? And I include this book as kind of a coffee table book. It's the university, I think, has been over the years a little reticent to investigate and fully confront its history in the same way that, Americans often are. And now is a great time because it can really sort of open its arms to all these stories. But it's also difficult. The university is not this monolithic thing, as you suggest. It's like a lot of different constituencies. It's the faculty, it's the administrators, it's the students, but it's also the alumni, it's the parents, it's the staff, the people who are living in this community in the shadow of this giant institution. All these different people have their own sense of what the University of Virginia means. And so, to some extent, maybe the advantage of a book like this, which is a little atomized with 100 different objects that each have their own story to tell, is it provides a lot of entry points for different people who have different experiences of the university, and it means something different for them.
You've been listening to the Citizens Band Radio Hour, a production of the Center for Media and Citizenship at the University of Virginia. Archived podcasts are available online at mediaandcitizenship.org. The executive producers for the program are Siva Vaidyanathan and Coy Barefoot.